under those circumstances, taking a more pragmatic approach and for example, filtering from a relatively young age for a man who will make a loyal, devoted, and virtuous partner is probably it's probably a better starting point than spending your 20s and early 30s having an exciting time with bad boys and then living hand to mouth.
Radical what?
Radical loyalty and radical solidarity.
Okay. So my sense with that, you tell me what you think about this, is that I think life is well conceptualized as a romantic adventure if it's lived properly. And part of that romantic adventure obviously is romance. And then you might ask, well, what are the preconditions for romance? Now you're making a case that pursuing short-term attraction as a maiden is not advisable, that should be replaced by a more mature orientation that would have to do with radical loyalty. But then I might also point out that, you could have your cake and eat it too on that front, because my suspicions are that the more radical the loyalty, the more romance there is in the relationship. So for example, we know now, 60 years after the dawn of the transhumanist sexual revolution, that the people who have the most sex are religious married couples. So it could easily be, and I believe this to be the case, because I don't think that a man and woman can give themselves to each other, like say fully on the sexual side, and I think this is probably particularly true of women, if that encounter isn't occurring within the confines of something like a relationship characterized by radical loyalty, because the offering on the woman's side is much greater.
Yeah, this is very difficult terrain because so many young people are growing up now without healthy models of relationships themselves. They may have grown up in a broken home or a toxic family environment themselves. They may have very few relationship models to draw inspiration from other than what they find on the internet, whether that's some guru or the group chat or wherever it is that they're drawing inspiration from. And and I suspect that we're going to go, even if we see a backswing towards people trying to form more enduring relationships, but there are going to be some very painful teething troubles as people really fundamentally find themselves in the situation of having to reverse engineer healthy social solidarity from scratch with absolutely no pointers and very little in the way of inner resilience to build from. And I know personally of some people who've had intensely difficult times with that and sometimes been through quite harrowing experiences as a consequence of really, taking a very reductive marriage ideology from the internet and then trying to apply that in the real world, only to discover that actually in practice it's life is just more complicated than that. And this is a sort of tragic situation that young people a great many young people find themselves in now, having had very little in the way of wider social fabric to draw from, often very little in the way of a support structure, and then find themselves trying to have kids and then live together in the long term with almost no scaffolding around them at all. But they're trying, and I salute them for it, and I suppose at this point it's a bare hope on my part that we can find our way out the other side, to the point where there are some older survivors of that first generation of pioneers who'll then be able to share their wisdom with younger men and women and say, here are some things I learned from trying and screwing up in a bunch of different ways, and maybe here are some things to bear in mind. But yeah, we can only hope. Human cultures and the human social fabric is resilient over the long term. And even if we've reached a point of fairly extreme social liquefaction at this point, I remain optimistic that we could come out the other side and find ourselves somewhere perhaps healthier and more constructive over the long term.
All right, Mary, look, I think that's probably a good place to draw this to a close. We got through the 3 sections of your book and had a fairly intense discussion about all 3 of those, certainly introduced everybody to the ideas that you're developing. And so I would very much recommend that people pay attention to your work. There's a number of, you mentioned Louise Perry. There's a number of scholars in this more expansive feminist tradition who've emerged on the public stage as of late. And so that's all to the good, as far as I'm concerned. Rethinking our commitment to such things as, well, biochemical interventions to alter the way that we handle the deepest levels of our nature. Maybe we could close with this, if you'd like. What do you classified yourself earlier in the podcast as a classic liberal, and so you're tilting to the side of minimally regulated individual freedom as the best strategy for psychological development, long-term social stability. The open question there, of course, is how much that can actually function in the absence of an underlying uniting ethos. Let me ask you a question related to that. Where do you stand with regards to such things as the liberalization of the divorce laws, and also with regards to contraception? So what is all you're thinking about this?
Just to clarify, when I said I'm thus far a liberal, that was in the context of my generally describing myself to anybody who asks as a reactionary. So I'm
fine, got it.
I'm some distance from being characterized, generally speaking, as a classical liberal. Although I possibly started out there at some point or another. But as a reactionary, I mean a reactionary feminist, as I like to style myself, my stance on no-fault divorce is that it's disastrous, and my stance on contraception is that there's a robust feminist case against the pill. And in fact, so much so that I devoted a chapter to it in Feminism Against Progress. So the feminist case against the contraceptive pill.
What about other forms of contraception? I mean, there's a part of me that keeps thinking that maybe the damn Catholics were correct, Now, that's a thought that I haven't been willing to entertain fully. Well, you can make a case that it might be possible for sensible people to use some intelligence when it comes to family planning, but the evidence that that's the way things have turned out is pretty damn shaky. So I'm curious about your stance on contraception in general.
I'm very ambivalent on this, to be honest. I think my central objection to the contraceptive pill is its transhumanist characteristic. And so I have a blanket objection to hormonal contraception across the board on that basis. It screws women up at the biochemical level. It screws up relations between the sexes. It affects mate choice. I mean, we're familiar with the contemporary research on this. It's catastrophic. It's ecologically catastrophic. It's having a disastrous effect on aquatic life. It's bad across the board. And so there's also an ecological case against the pill as well as a feminist one. So I have and other forms of hormonal contraception as well. With the rest of them, I'm more ambivalent about this. I think where you're not breaking something which is working normally, I'm less uncomfortable about contraception than I am with hormonal interventions in our physiology. So I think for now, I think I'll take a squashy centrist stance on that and say, what to me seems the approach most conducive to employing technologies in a way which is ordered to our nature rather than in revolt against our nature would probably be some form of fertility tracking in conjunction with a barrier method, for example, which I think is fairly common practice amongst not especially radical Roman Catholics, for example, who'll use some kind of barrier method or just abstain at the danger points. So I think but to me, really, I think the way forward is not to pretend that we can put all of our technologies back in the box, but it's to try and find constructive ways of reordering those technologies that we have to the realities of our nature, which have not changed. And so I suppose the governing approach that I would advocate on that basis for fertility planning, which is something that women have always sought to do, long before we came up with something like the contraceptive pill. But families have always sought to manage fertility at various times and for different reasons, would be to try and employ those technologies that we have in a way which is ordered to our nature and supports our flourishing in accordance with our nature, rather than setting out to wage war on that nature. So I think that would be my centrist approach to the contraception.
I guess the question there is, how do you distinguish between what's central and what's peripheral? But that's a perfectly reasonable thing to attempt to think through. And I can certainly understand your point. I mean, the hormonal effects of the pill are much more pervasive than anybody had dared to imagine. They might have disrupted the relationships between men and women, young men and women, on a permanent and political basis, quasi-permanent and political basis, in ways that we can barely begin to understand. So, I mean, I know, for example, that women on the pill like masculine men less. And, that's actually a major problem. We have no idea what the political ramifications of that are. All right, Mary. So thank you very much for talking to me today and for providing your knowledge for the benefit of everybody who's watching and listening. Thank you to all of those of you who are actually watching and listening as well.